This is Dan Schneider, and this is another episode of American Television with Mitchell Hadley. On our last episode, we sort of stumbled upon an idea. I think Mitch was talking about Gary Moore, and I mentioned how he was a forgotten personality. Then afterwards, Mitch emailed me and said we should do shows on more forgotten personalities, like we do on still known quantities, like a Mary Tyler Moore or Edward R. Murrow. And I thought that was a good idea. And so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing a show talking about the now almost totally forgotten by anyone under the age of 50, Gary Moore. But before we do that, Mitch, welcome. And if you could introduce yourself to people who've never seen you before on this show.
Sure. I am Mitchell Hadley. I'm a classic television historian. I write about classic TV and its relationship with American pop culture at the website itsabouttv.com. I've also written 2 books about television. Those are available at my website as well. The latest one, Darkness in Prime Time, talks about how programs of the classic TV era forecast the kinds of things we're seeing in today's world.
Since this is the first show we're going to be doing in this Forgotten Stars show, I think I'll call it something maybe like Forgotten Remembered or something. But before we talk about Gary Moore specifically, let's talk about the phenomenon of sort of cultural memory. Because if you go back in 20-year chunks, even you don't have to be 50 years. There are sitcoms that were fairly popular around the turn of the century that, when I hear them, I mean, I might have watched an episode or half an episode once and said, no, this is shit. I'm not watching any more of it. Why do you think that celebrity churn, if we want to call it that, has gotten to the point whereas now a person's celebrity is lucky to last 5 years, much less 50 years like a Gary Moore had?
It's an interesting question, and I think that part of it has to do just with the kind of culture that has evolved, where we go through things extremely quickly. Churn is a good word for it because you'll just chew it up and then spit it out. So celebrity is very fleeting in that sense. You're always applying celebrities against the right now test. So if somebody hasn't done something right now, if they're not in the public view right now, it's as if they never existed. And then you've got changing times, changing mores. Seinfeld was all about nothing at the time, and now Jerry Seinfeld's become a very controversial figure because of the Jewish turbulence in this country and people boycotting him for one reason or another. So you've got a combination of things, I think, that talk about why it is so rapid right now. I think that probably social media is one of the biggest parts of that, the need to stay in front of the public constantly. And so it's not enough that you may have had a show on recently. It's what have you done for me in the last 5 seconds, literally. I think if you go back farther, when we start to get into the question of somebody like Gary Moore, a lot of it has to do with how available things are. In Moore's case, most of his shows aren't available on video. The ones that are mostly I've Got a Secret and To Tell the Truth. We'll get into the specifics of that. But I think a lot of it is just availability. And then as you get closer and closer to modern times, it is centrality. What have you done lately? I saw something really appalling the other day. And you might agree with this, being that we're more or less of the same era. There was someone talking about the Daily Planet in Superman and how the globe that is so iconic in the movie. They mentioned to someone at the, I think it was the Daily News in New York, that they should have gotten that Daily Planet globe from the movie and put it into their own lobby. Well, this person not only wasn't aware of the globe, they weren't aware of the movie, they'd never heard of Superman.
Hmm.
So, what do you do in a situation like that? I don't know. But this cultural amnesia, this idea that whatever is more than literally a year old, 6 months ago, that's in the past for so many people. I think that really is what it goes to.
Yeah, and one other thing before we get in on more, it seems that the very idea of well, fame and celebrity are sort of different. Celebrity as just being known, fame is being known for something great or something. But it seems that celebrities of yore uh, were non-pareil. There was no mistaking them. Whatever you thought of Alfred Hitchcock as a filmmaker, that profile, the voice, the image, it was Hitchcock. Jimmy
Yeah.
Cagney was Jimmy Cagney. Now you look at, well, you had Robert Redford, and now Brad Pitt is other Robert Redford, and there's probably going to be another good-looking blonde guy who's going to be the leading movie hunk. You had Madonna as a singer, now Lady Gaga, and you're going to have someone else that's going to be in their vein, and they're more replaceable. It's as if the celebrities now, there's a need for celebrity, but it doesn't matter who or what the celebrity is, just that they fill some role.
Hmm. And they're also, we kind of live in a world where everybody gets to be a celebrity and everybody has their own brand. As an author, I'm constantly inundated with suggestions and tips on how to increase my brand, how to build my brand visibility. I don't have a brand, but you've got athletes not only have name recognition, they have a brand, they have a logo, they have their own logo besides the logo of any team they might play for. So in a way, we've gotten to the point where everybody's a celebrity, and if everybody is a celebrity, nobody's a celebrity. And so you've got Hitchcock with his iconic profile, and you have other celebrities that were known for particular things, but now everybody seems to have something like that embedded in their brand, and so it loses its quality of being unique. It isn't special, and if you're not special, then you've got to grab people's attention some other way by being controversial, by being on the hot button issues, and those are so variable. They're here today and gone tomorrow, and so is your celebritydom if you depended on that for visibility.
Well, Gary Moore is one of those people that checks off a lot of the boxes of things that we've talked about almost like every other show. He started in radio, had a celebrity in
Mhm.
TV. He quit, came back. He was across a broad spectrum of things in television. He seems to be one of those almost, what was it, the Tom Hanks guy was in the box
Oh,
of
yeah,
cherries. Yeah, he's
yeah,
one of those people that you're going to see him with people who may still be known as celebrities, and they're like, who's that guy that was with her and her and her and him? You know.
yeah. What's interesting about Gary Moore, and one of the reasons I was intrigued about talking about him is because he does tick all of the boxes. And when you look at his status as a celebrity in the 1960s, it is extraordinary. Um, in 1963, this is when he had two shows on in prime time. He had his own variety show, The Gary Moore Show, and he was also the host of I've Got a Secret. And at that point in time, Moore was reported to be making $43,000 a week. That meant that his annual salary, if you were to expand that out, was about $2 million a year in 1963. That would be inflation adjusted almost $25 million a year today. Now, at that same time, he also held the world record for having more time spent in front of a TV camera than any other person in the world. He'd been on TV more than anyone. So the idea that you could have a man who had all those qualities, had two primetime shows, had been on TV for nearly 20 years, and had appeared on it for more hours than anybody else, to go from that to being almost completely unremembered today is just an extraordinary thing. It is so curious, and it really forces us to look back on his career and appreciate what it was. And I think as we do that, we may actually start to get some clues from Moore himself as to why his fame, such as it was, wasn't lasting.
So why don't we start from the beginning? Who was Gary Moore? Where did he come from, etc.?
Okay, well, he was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1915. His name at birth was Thomas Garrison Morfitt. And when he got into radio later on, it was felt that his name, Morfitt, I think it was hard to pronounce, hard to remember. So they actually had a contest. And then they chose a new name for him, Gary Moore. And so that's the name he went with for the rest of his career. He started out with an utterly ordinary life, as so many of them did. He went to City College in Baltimore. He was involved in theater and public speaking and comedy. So he had the prerequisite background that he was comfortable as an entertaining student, as somebody who could go up in front of an audience, enjoyed that kind of work. And when the opportunity came, he left school before he graduated. Again, that kind of tells us something about the entrepreneurial sense of the times. He struck out on his own and went into radio, 1937. He saw it as an opportunity, something that he'd be able to strike in, make a name out of it, enjoy working in. So he went to local radio in 37. That's where he got his start. And for both radio and television, when you look at the early days of each, you find that opportunities are everywhere for somebody who's willing to work for them, somebody who's willing to take a chance to do different kinds of things. It's not at all extraordinary in the early days of TV that you could go from being a janitor to being on camera if you were simply willing to work. And in Moore's case, he was. He was an announcer on the radio. He was a writer. He was a performer. So he had a number of different roles that he could fill, and he got a lot of experience doing that. And that's kind of where everything begins for him.
Yeah, he seems to have been one of those people, too, that seemed more comfortable letting others take the primary role in whatever they were doing. There's one or two skits that from his old show that's clear. As a game show host, he often deferred to the panelists that he had and let them get the laugh, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. He, in a sense, he was almost, I guess I would say, almost the variety show equivalent of a Bud Abbott. You know, he was content being the straight man and letting other people get the attention.
Yes, and that's where we see this first early indication of his own explanation as to why he might not be the big name today, because he was very comfortable staying in the background. He did not look at himself as the focal point throughout his career. You'll see that he did not like to do self-promotion. He didn't like to court attention from the media. He always pointed toward the people he worked with and built around all of them. He felt that there was a team approach to that kind of thing, and he didn't look for controversy. He didn't look for anything that would make the focal point become him. And when you combine that with his early background, as he, if we look at his first significant role in radio, it was as a sidekick, not as the center, but as the straight man, the sidekick. He started working with Jimmy Durante. And he and Durante had a very successful show on the radio from 43 to 47. Now, Moore had, as we said, been in radio before that. He had a show of his own, a talent show in 1941 before the war. Then, as so many celebrities did, he went, fought in the war, performed in the war. There's nothing particularly significant about that, although he did work with his longtime announcer and sidekick, Durwood Kirby, and we'll get into that as well. But to your point, when he comes out and he's back stateside in 43, and working with Jimmy Durante. It's called the Durante-Moore Show. It's a very popular variety show of the time, and he has this reputation as being very approachable. He's very much the kind of person who can interact with the audience. He has a warm personality, and he's the straight man. He sets up Durante wonderfully. And when you look at what it takes to be a sidekick, a straight man like that, it requires that ability to be able to not only be comfortable with yourself in the background, be comfortable with the idea of setting other people up for laughs rather than getting them yourself, but it also needs to have that likability quality. People have got to like you, not just the person you're working with, in this case Durante, but the people who are listening, because your importance to the act as it is to remain likable. If people don't like you, Durante is going to suffer even more than you do. So I think we see all the hallmarks of Moore's career very early on.
Yeah, and another person that we've mentioned, and you've mentioned quite a bit in this run of shows we've talked about, is Arthur Godfrey. And it looks like Moore got a break when Arthur Godfrey show went on summer hiatus one year.
Yes, yes, that was one of his big opportunities. He works, as I say, with the Durante show until 47. Then he does other radio gigs. He's a sidekick on other programs. He's a guest on other programs. And in 1950, he gets his own show called The Gary Moore Show. And what leads up to that is that he is filling in as the summer replacement for Arthur Godfrey. When Godfrey and his friends goes on a break, or when he goes off for the summer, it's Moore that's filling in. So in both 1950 and 1951, Moore gets this huge break of being on prime time in a very valuable hour, filling in for one of the most popular entertainers on television. So it's interesting because it's not that Godfrey is a mentor to him per se, but it is taking advantage of this opportunity presented by Godfrey and learning from Godfrey as to what is successful that kind of leads to Moore's first national exposure. And as was the case there, it doesn't mean that he gets his own primetime hour immediately. In fact, what happens is, because of his success filling in for Moore, they say, well, let's put you on in the morning on radio next to Moore, or next to Godfrey, right after Godfrey, or right before Godfrey, but let's team the two of you up on the schedule. And so what happens is Moore gets his daily Monday through Friday radio program, the Gary Moore Show. It's a very light variety hour. There's nothing extraordinary about it, but it plays very well because of his personality, because it is an easygoing type of show. Unlike Godfrey, it's free of drama, it's free of personalities. Moore likes to keep things simple, so it's a very unstructured show, and that is where we see him begin to establish his presence on radio and television on a national basis. CBS quickly decides what they're going to do is simulcast the show. So his show is heard on radio and seen on television at the same time, as was Godfrey's show at that time. So it becomes a foundational part of CBS's morning lineup. They have their Today Show clone, which is hosted by a variety of people. Cronkite hosted it, Jack Tarr hosted it, even Dick Van Dyke eventually hosted it. Then you've got some game shows, you've got Godfrey, you've got Moore. And that's very important structurally for radio and television early on in the 50s.
Before we go on to talk about his game show career and whatnot, it's interesting because over the course of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and maybe even to the early 70s, there were, it looks like, about 6 or 7 various iterations of The Gary Moore Show. Were they all basically the same show, just split up into different media and to different eras, or did he grow and evolve in any way?
Well, the original radio program kind of creates the template for what Moore wanted his show to be like. He wanted it to be filled with some comic sketches, with a light monologue, with some musical guests. And he didn't want any one of those to dominate. He just wanted light entertainment, very casual, very much of a way to be able to entertain and reach out to the audience. As he evolves in television and his show continues and then it moves to prime time, it occupies an hour. So we do have an expansion, but rather than changing any kind of format or going in a different direction, it's really just kind of an evolution of what he's already been doing. He has to do more of it because it's going to take up more time, but he's very much at ease talking directly to the audience. It's a time in television where the star does commercials as part of the show. So he's a commercial pitch man at the same time. He's talking right to you on TV and in the audience. It's very casual patter. His announcer, Derwood Kirby, is part of a lot of the skits. So they're pattering back and forth on air. As I say, very unstructured in that sense. That's how it is for most of his run. Now, he does have a feature in his primetime show, in the original primetime show, which goes from, I think, 58 to 64. It becomes a centerpiece of the show, and it was called That Wonderful Year. And it becomes kind of a musical review of a particular year in history. 30s, 40s, 50s, what have you. But they show it's kind of like the kind of thing you'll see Carol Burnett, one of his proteges, do later on, where you have a musical celebration of the year, the kinds of music that were played, some things about current events, some light skits and character things, and you've got Moore not playing the central role necessarily. He's keeping things moving along. He is acting in these, but he is just part of an ensemble. I mean, maybe that's a good way to look at it, that Moore never saw himself as the star with a supporting cast. He always found himself as part of an ensemble, a family, if you will, that we're all working together to bring the entertainment. That is pretty much the format that everybody would remember of the Moore Show. If you do run across clips on the Internet Archive or YouTube, and they are out there, that's probably what you're going to see, is the hour-long version that does My Favorite Year and brings in a few guest stars, but stars that are quite compatible with how the show goes. And often no guest stars at all, just as regular supporting cast. Again, think about Carol Burnett. Now, when his show comes back, there's a lot to go to get to this point, but in the last national iteration of the Gary Moore Show, which runs from 66 to 67, the network wants him to put more of an accent on guest stars. He wants it to be more celebrity driven rather than organically developing from what they have. And this is something he's not comfortable with, never did like it. And I don't think he was all that pleased with the new Gary Moore Show. When you read the interviews that he gave at the time, or when he talked about the show in retrospect, he would often say that it had gotten too far away from what he had wanted to do, which was to just work together as a group to present this very pleasant show. When he was of mixed feelings when the show went off the air the first time. He wanted to get back into television, and so that's why they had the new Gary Moore Show, but it never lived up to what he wanted it to be. And after that, you're looking at the game shows and you're looking at the occasional guest appearance on a different show or a special, but you're never seeing the Gary Moore Show again.
So we have talked about the 1950s quiz show scandal several times. But the 50s was sort of, they were on what we call the rubric of game shows. There were basically three types, it seems to me. There were the quiz shows, which were intellectual, and you'd have to know Napoleon's waistline or whatnot. There was the sillier stuff, the more childish stuff, things like Beat the Clock and stuff where people would do crazy stunts or whatnot. And then there was the sort of middlebrow stuff right in the middle, which very much suits more the Goodson Todman shows, things like I've Got a Secret, which he hosted, To Tell the Truth, which he hosted later on, What's My Line, where you basically had these celebrity panelists, and they would they'd wear masks, they'd try to guess who the celebrity was, what this person did. I've got to see. So it was sort of quasi-intellectual, somewhere middle brow between the silly stuff and the quiz show stuff, where an intellectual like the son of a professor could become an overnight celebrity. So let's talk about, before we get to more, the Goodson Todman formula for those three and a few other shows. I've Got a Secret, To Tell the Truth, What's My Line, and how more fit into that so well.
Sure. The first hit that Goodson Todman had was What's My Line? And so in a sense, all their other shows of this type were an evolution or a spin-off from that. And the formula for What's My Line was pretty simple. It was called a panel show. And if you look at TV Guide back in the day, you won't see it referred to as either a game show or a quiz show. It's a panel show because it's made up of a panel of celebrities, usually four, and a host. And the host is not the center of attention. He is there to keep things going. He moderates, and often that they're called an MC or a moderator, but they're not the driver of the show itself, and they're not the focal point of humor. They are there to serve as a foil or to set up some of the panelists for themselves, but they aren't there to say, again, hey, look at me. They're also there to sympathize with the contestants. Now, sympathize sounds like kind of a strange word to use, but as you say, we're talking in all of these shows, all of the Goodson Todman shows, you've got these famous celebrities, and then you've got just an ordinary person most of the time who either has an odd job or they have an odd secret or they have accomplished something, but people don't really know who they are. And their job is to stump the panel. So the success of the show depends on a number of things. It depends on the host's ability to set the guest at ease. If you've got a guest who's nervous, who's tense, doesn't know what to do, it's going to be bad. It's bad television. So you've got to have that knack of being able to put them at ease. It was something that all of the Goodson Todman hosts did wonderfully. And Gary Moore is a particular example of that because he was so warm and comfortable with audiences. He was able to put people at ease. You've also got to have this idea that it is the host and the contestant versus the panel. Now, as I say, the contestant's job is to stump the panel. The panel's job is to guess the contestant's secret or job or accomplishment. The longer that the contestant can stump the panel, the more money the contestant makes. And when you look at John Daly as the prototype of the host of this kind of show, John never made any bones about the fact that he was on the contestant's side. It was he and the contestant versus the panel, and he would do everything he could to make it difficult for the panel to get the right answer. He would obfuscate. He would get incredibly verbose in trying to give an answer. He would give answers that he would suggest answers. I didn't want to say that. It's the contestant who's giving the answer, but Daly would suggest things in such a way as to make it as difficult as possible for the panel to get the right answer. And this is what Moore is doing as well. He is he's sitting next to the panelist. It's the two, or the contestant. It's the two of them right there, and it's a great setup. And Moore does this so well. He's able to make it very intimate because this is an evolution from What's My Line. In What's My Line, you'll remember the guest came in and signed in. And then John Daly would say, let's show the audience in the theater and the audience at home what your line is. And they would superimpose it on the screen. Well, I've Got a Secret takes this a step further. They do superimpose the secret on the screen for the home audience and for the people at the studio. But Moore also leans over to the contestant and cups his ear like this, and he says, I'll have you whisper the secret in my ear, although he clearly knows what it is. But it's just another theatrical touch that I think endears him to both the contestant and the audience. So if we take John Daly as the prototypical host, the gold standard of what a panel show host is, Moore capitalizes on this wonderfully. He has all of the qualities that are needed to be successful in the Goodson-Todman stable. Again, he's not the source of comedy. He is there to set up the panel, and he is very warm with the contestants. That's all you need. And so from 52 to 64, he's the host of that show in prime time, and it does wonderfully in the ratings. It's a wonderful show.
I know about a decade or so ago I had a job working second shift till midnight, and in the early afternoon there was a mini netlet that they were just starting up then, and it would show the old game show. I think that it was called Buzzer. I don't know if it's still around. And you would see these three shows, the Goodman Todman shows. You know, I'd be doing my final stuff, having lunch, getting dressed to go to work and whatnot, and so you'd have I've Got a Secret, What's My Line, and To Tell the Truth. Maybe it's me, but in having watched them, because they will run back to back to back over an hour, the last hour and a half that before I went to work, it seems to me that I've Got a Secret, though, was definitely the number 3 show in turn. I don't know what order they were created, but it seemed that To Tell the Truth and What's My Line seemed a little more high profile. Is that correct?
Yeah, What's My Line is probably at the top, and part of it is because it was the first, but it had this air of sophistication to it. You know, all the men on the show wore tuxedos, and the women wore evening dress, and it was very formal in an affectionate kind of way. The host was always Mr. Daly, and the panelists were always Mr. Cerf or Miss Francis or Miss Kilgallen. So there was this real sense of class. I remember my wife telling me that her my mother-in-law, never liked to watch What's My Line, because she always thought the people on there were snooty. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the atmosphere it gives off. Now, you've got I've Got a Secret, which is definitely more casual than that. And then you have To Tell the Truth, which has this great gimmick of having a certified affidavit being read at the start of each segment, where the person who, it's a variation of a secret, you know, the person who has this accomplishment signs this affidavit saying what they've done. Then you've got to guess which one of the 3 people standing before you is actually that person. Yeah, you know, I think that you might be right that of the 3 of them, I've Got a Secret might have been the most casual, I suppose I would call it. But also, it did have a phenomenally long run, because it was on from 52 to 67, and it dropped out as kind of an ancillary part of the rural purge. I would call it the demographic purge. But it only ran 2 years shorter than What's My Line, which again is the gold standard for that. So if it was the red-haired stepchild in some way, it was never really treated that way by either the network or Goodson-Todman. It held up on its own. You know, a fun fact about I've Got a Secret is it was created by Alan Sherman, who most people would remember as And here's another forgotten celebrity we may want to talk about sometime. Alan Sherman was a comedian who had a tremendous parody hit called "Hello Mudda, Hello Fada." He was the forerunner of Weird Al, and besides that, though, he also came up with the idea for "I've Got a Secret," and so he was the co-executive producer of the program.
I've Got a Secret, of the three of them, also seemed to be the most in touch with the then current events. Because I remember an episode that was taped within a week or so of when the basketball player Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points. And so here you had the sight of this humongous giant black man who comes on stage, young black man, and the guy who's over twice his age, a short white guy who's standing on a stool next to him. And I think that's one of the reasons that the show had popularity, was that, what's my line? I mean, they would have a big celebrity if they were promoting a movie or whatnot, but you would get things like that. And I could be wrong, but I think there was also, was it on I've Got a Secret that Neil Armstrong's parents came on?
Yes, the Neil Armstrong episode, yes. The second class of astronauts were introduced to the public during the run of I've Got a Secret. And the secret in this particular segment of the program was an older couple whose secret was our son was just introduced as an astronaut today. Now, the show's live, so that's one of the reasons it can really react to things going on. It's live. And so they go through, they stump the panel, and as it turns out, they are the parents of Neil Armstrong, who is just, Neil Armstrong is just a test pilot, and now he's a new astronaut too. John Glenn, at least, had been a minor celebrity. He had made some major accomplishments as a test pilot himself, and then he had been a contestant on Name That Tune. So you could be expected to know John Glenn, perhaps, but nobody really knew Neil Armstrong from anything. And so Moore goes through the post-segment interview with the parents, and then at the very end of it, there's this extremely curious moment where he says, now I know we're looking ahead to the future, and this is off a long way in the distance, but how would you feel if it turned out that your son was the first man to walk on the moon? And it's an extraordinary moment, and it's so much so that it shows up in television history books. It shows up in Neil Armstrong's biography. It shows up in Gary Moore's biography, and it's on YouTube. A lot of the I've Got a Secret episodes were preserved, and that, including that one. And you can go on there and you can see Gary Moore asking Neil Armstrong's parents how they would feel if their son was the first man to walk on the moon. It is a singular moment in television history to see it. But you've hit the nail right on the head in talking about Moore in general. The absurdity of him posing with Wilt Chamberlain is something he had no problem doing, because after all, his job is to make the show funny, not necessarily by telling the jokes. He doesn't care who gets the jokes. He cares about that the show gets the laughs. And so if it's funny to play up the fact that he was a short gentleman, that's fine with him. That was a running joke with Durward Kirby, who is about my height. Kirby was nowhere near as tall as Wilt Chamberlain. He was about 6'4", 6'5", but he towered over Gary Moore, who was probably 5'6" or something. And Moore knew the comedic value of that. So did he have any problem with that? No, it served the show, and that's what made people warmly appreciate his presence. It was very, very avuncular, very warm presence.
So, just being video about Ozzy.
Warm presence, yeah.
So let's talk about the main Gary Moore show of the 60s. We mentioned a little bit of this a while back when we did a show on Carol Burnett. And I think it was actually the last show we did about Carol Burnett becoming famed on the Gary Moore Show. And you mentioned Durwood Kirby. He's another perfect example of someone who was a celebrity, even if he was maybe because he was a rung lower than Moore because he was the sidekick. But it seems to me, if anyone even knows or has any clue, they might be because of the parody that Rocky and Bullwinkle did, calling it the Kerwood Derby, like the Brown Derby restaurant, and they think Kerwood Derby is the name. So who was Durwood Kirby, and what was his effect on Gary Moore?
Well, Durwood Kirby was his announcer and his sidekick. And you have to remember, going back to the days of radio, that was a fairly traditional setup for radio. You had the host of a program, and you had someone who is loosely referred to as the announcer. He would announce the show at the beginning. He would announce it at the end. He would do the commercials during the program, and he would often be a character on the show as either a member of the skits or as a foil for the host. And this is what Durwood Kirby did for Gary Moore. It's what Ed McMahon did for Johnny Carson.
Johnny Olson.
Yes, exactly. Johnny Olson for so many people. Yes, and it's what Lyle Waggoner did with Carol Burnett. Again, another example of that. But Kirby worked with Moore in the war. And they had first started to collaborate in the late 30s when Moore was a guest on, or one of the members of the radio program Club Matinee, and Kirby was the announcer for that show. And afterwards, they kept working together. They worked together on the radio show. They both went over into television, and he pretty much stayed with Moore for the entire run of the Gary Moore Show in all of its iterations on radio and television. He was also the co-host of Candid Camera, which began as a segment on the Gary Moore Show. Actually began, I think, as Candid Microphone on the radio, but it was a segment of the Gary Moore shows, and then it was spun off into its own half-hour program. And after a disastrous year where Arthur Godfrey was put in as the co-host of the show, that did not work at all, and so Kirby took over as the co-host for the rest of the original run of Candid Camera, along with Alan Funt. So there's this close identification, even on Kirby's solo projects, with working with Moore. And so they stayed together that whole time.
So did this iteration, and did all the iterations, but this one especially, did it have 4 or 5 regulars? Are we talking something that we could look back and say, oh, it's like the Carol Burnett Show, it's like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In? It was, what space did it occupy in the variety sphere?
Mm-hmm. It again, I think, is very similar to the Burnett Show in a sense. Carol Burnett was the breakout star on the Gary Moore Show. He had booked her as a guest on his daytime and early television shows because he was really impressed. He'd seen her in the nightclubs. He'd seen her on Broadway. He'd seen her doing some TV guest spots. And so he was really impressed. He saw something there. And that eventually she wound up as a regular. She, I think, filled in for a guest that was sick, couldn't make it. She came in very short notice. You asked her if she could learn the material on 2 days' notice. Perfect. And that she was so impressive in that after the show, he asked her to become a regular. And that was it. From 69 through 62, 63, she is a regular on the show. He had a couple of other regulars, and their names are escaping me at the moment. They did not create a substantial, I don't think they created a substantial visibility outside of the Moore Show, but they were far from unknown. They had been popular in nightclubs, on television. That's the kind of member of the cast he really went for was having somebody who had that comic talent, had proven themselves, had worked in nightclubs in front of audiences. That's always very important, and was able to work as part of the ensemble. So, short answer to your question: yes, you had Moore, you had Kirby, you had Burnett. You always had a couple of other people. You frequently had a guest star, and that formed their equivalent of the regular players on the show, who would do the skits, who would act in various things, who would appear in non-comedic types of situations where it would be kind of like the family talking about something. He had some guests like Cliff Arquette, who were frequent guests. Cliff Arquette as Charlie Weaver. People would remember him from Hollywood Squares, but Cliff played that Charlie Weaver character in many shows, including the Gary Moore show. So he was never a regular, but he was a frequent guest, always came on, read his letter from home, which got a lot of comedic oomph out of it. And that was his little corner of the show. So yeah, that was basically the structure of the Moore show, and I think that we don't want to make this all about Carol Burnett, except to the point that she learned from one of the best, and she learned several things, many things from him about how to do a variety show, and I think you can see it from having an announcer to having regulars to the structure of the show, the skit comedy and the musical things, to doing these occasional full book musical type segments. It's very easy to see where she got that from. And he was the one who had encouraged her when she had the contract with CBS. And it had the clause in it that said she had the right within the first 5 years of the contract to demand that the network offer her a variety show. And he was the one who encouraged her to do that, to take advantage of that. He commented in an interview later on that he had seen very early on that she had the talent and the ability to host a variety show, and he urged her to work toward that and hold out for that.
So it's the mid 1960s. The Gary Moore show is canceled. He's still got a few years left to go for I've Got a Secret, but then he walks away from it all. It's interesting since he was so well known, so highly paid. What spurred him walking away from it at the height of his career?
Yeah, it's a sad part of Moore's story, I think. The Gary Moore show was still very popular, but it was forced off the air by CBS. It was not fitting the right demographic, and Jim Aubrey, the infamous James Aubrey, who was the head of programming for CBS, didn't like it, and so he had it canceled, even though it was certainly doing well in the ratings. It didn't appeal to the kind of audience that he wanted to have. Now, what happened after that? Well, Moore was stung by that. He was bitter about having gotten dumped by Aubrey, and so he quit I've Got a Secret. Now that isn't exactly what the story was at the time. At the time, he had said that, look, I've been on doing shows for a long time. I was on 5 days a week for years. I hosted 2 primetime shows for years. The variety show is over. Now I'd just kind of like to step back a bit and look at some other opportunities to redirect my energies, so to speak. But in fact, he had been stung quite badly by the way Aubrey had treated him. And so I think he saw this as an opportunity to kind of send a message, kind of like, take that back to the network. So he quit I've Got a Secret, and that was taken over by Steve Allen. And just a word about that, because I'm a big fan of Steve Allen as well as Gary Moore. But we touched on this a little bit in our show about Steve Allen. The I've Got a Secret that Allen hosted was not successful. It ran for 3 years and it was still funny, but you had that very problem. Allen was a man who was used to being the center of attention. He was used to driving the humor of being set up by others, not of setting others up. So whereas Moore's temperament and style was perfect for a show like that, Allen's wasn't. The panel often had the feeling that, Henry Morgan commented on this once, who is one of the, I think he was on virtually the entire run of I've Got a Secret. And in fact, when Gary Moore was on vacation, he would host the show. We ought to do a show about him sometime too, because he's really quite an interesting guy. But he said that he always had the feeling that Allen was on the show expecting the panelists to set him up. And that's completely the opposite of the way it had gone, the opposite of the way Moore did it. And so we can see how talented Moore was at that. But there, in all of this, in all of getting his show canceled and then leaving I've Got a Secret, there is a nugget of truth to this idea that he wanted to do something different. What he wanted to get into was news. He had always been active. He was very active politically. He campaigned for candidates. He was very well informed on the issues. And he had wanted for some time to get into the news business. He was interested in either being a correspondent or being on the news or doing something that was public affairs or news related. And CBS wasn't interested in that. First of all, they had this policy that prevented any of their celebrity talent from getting involved in the news end of things, which is certainly different from how things are now. But he had an exclusive contract with CBS. So even after he left the Moore show and I've Got a Secret, CBS had first dibs on everything. And they weren't interested in him doing a public affairs type of program. He felt they weren't taking him seriously. He felt that they just weren't interested in the idea that he really could do something other than entertainment. So he got permission from the network. He made a pitch for a show that was called, I think, Gary Moore's People Poll. And he pitched it to CBS, and they said, predictably enough for them, no, we're not interested. And so he said, do you mind if I pitch it to another network? And finally, after all of this time, they said, go ahead. And so he pitched it to ABC. ABC picked up on it. And it was a one-time special. It was called Gary Moore's People Poll. And it was kind of a combination of man on the street and looking at polls on various questions and finding out how well the man on the street was in terms of being on the pulse of what the public and what society in general was doing. And it didn't go well. And he talks about this in an interview, a rather poignant interview that he does in TV Guide. I like to read just a couple of things about it because it shows his state of mind at that point in time. The interviewer asked him, why do you want to do another show? Why are you interested in going into the news? And he said, well, I'm only 51 years old. He looked older. He was one of those entertainers about whom it is said that he always looked young until he didn't. And for many years, he did have that youthful look with his crew cut and his puckish expressions and things like that. But then all of a sudden he was old, and he stayed old. And he says, I'm only 51 years old. My contract with CBS has 9 years to go. I'm getting paid for doing nothing. And he's asked the network to release him from the contract, and they've refused. He's even considering a lawsuit at this point in time to see if he can get out of the contract. But he's talking about doing news programs, people programs, more serious types of things to showcase the kinds of things that he himself is interested in politics, interested in international relations. Um, and so he gets the opportunity to do this show with ABC, which I suppose might have been a pilot, and it didn't go well. And he talks about that with his in another TV Guide interview. He says, "I thought I'd enjoy public affairs. Um, as a newsman, I was much in demand to read scripts that were already written for me. They did my research too. It was disillusioning." So he had gotten a chance to do some commentaries, but there were always things where he's just reading it. He's not really able to express himself. So he does the People Poll show, and he says, "I've learned that performers don't cross the line into public affairs. You're either a Gary Moore or a Walter Cronkite." And what he came away from this was he discovered he's not a Cronkite. And it bothers him a lot. If you read between the lines from these interviews, you get the sense of a man who feels for all his accomplishments, for all his achievements, he hasn't accomplished anything of importance. He's hosted a variety show. He's hosted a game show. His one chance to do something that he thought was more substantive didn't work. He's now 51 years old and he has nothing to do. And you can read the depression in what he's talking. He says it out loud, but even when he's not saying it, you can read it between the lines of what he's talking about. Even when he makes his comeback with variety stuff, he's being urged to get away from what made it successful in the first place. Instead of the nice, simple, informal show, they're asking him to load it up with guest stars, make it more like other shows that are on TV. He's losing control of it again. Even though it's variety and not news, he's in control of it. And so that's a poignant moment in his career. He gets a comeback opportunity in 1966. Aubrey has been fired by CBS by this point in time, and Moore sees the opportunity to come back. And so in 66, you've got the Gary Moore Show coming back. It's not called the new Gary Moore Show, but that's what it is. Durwood Kirby is back. Candid Camera is back. He doesn't have the same other cast, but it's the same kind of a program. But what does CBS do? Well, they put it up against Bonanza on Sunday nights, which was a death slot. The other show, the ABC Sunday Night Movie. This show has no chance from the very beginning. And so you have to wonder how much CBS even cared about it, if they were just humoring him. There is another kind of a sad clip that you'll see on YouTube, is Moore as the host of the 1966 new season, fall season preview for CBS. And so he is introducing shows like Mission Impossible. He does a little bit with Barbara Bain, and he talks about other shows that are going to be on, and he plugs his own show, We're Back, and I think we're going to be better than ever. You watch this now knowing that the show isn't a success. It does its 13 weeks or whatever and goes off the air, but it's kind of like he knows this is his last chance, and he's this close to being reduced to kind of a pitch man on behalf of the network. And so the show does not work. It is destroyed in competition by Bonanza in the movie. We're seeing the twilight of the variety show as it is. And for the variety shows that are successful, they are driven by people like Dean Martin, Tom Jones, the Smothers Brothers, who ironically get the time spot on Sunday night after Moore's canceled, replaced by the Smothers Brothers. What a change in programming, quite dramatic. But you're seeing that it's no longer enough that you're just a personality. You actually have to do something. And one one of the other comments Moore will make in the future is marveling at how much he got paid for simply being Gary Moore. You know, he said once, I can't sing, I can't act, I can't dance, I can't tell jokes. I'm just Gary Moore. And he's selling himself short. But there's a point to what he's saying. He is Gary Moore. That what he does better than anybody else is simply be Gary Moore. And all of a sudden, that's not a commodity that's in demand. And so increasingly, he's being seen as a relic, as something of his time. And when this show goes off the air, he's kind of being put into the nostalgia category, sort of like Milton Berle. And that sets up his final go in TV, which is To Tell the Truth.
Yeah, and before we get there, I just want to step back a little bit because apropos of his wanting to be a Cronkite type, in the Second World War, during that, he was reading apparently monologues of and essays and short stories on the radio with some seriousness. So, hold on. Let's see. Okay. Sorry. And so it's indicative of who he was trying to that there was always this desire to be something more than an entertainer. You talk about Steve Allen did Meeting of Minds. It seems that Gary Moore was trying to be that kind of a person, a more Steve Allen type, but he didn't. Maybe he didn't have the ego.
Well, I think that certainly is conceivable, and what you're mentioning about what he was doing during the war is precisely getting back again to what he talked about. Whenever he did get a chance to do something serious, it was always something that had been written by someone else, not something he had done himself. And so, I wonder, TV Guide in the late 60s and early 70s gets into a little bit of psychoanalyzing its guests as part of its trend toward being taken very seriously as a serious publication. Some of their writers dabble a little more in putting their subjects under analysis. And so there is a tendency in any interview to see the kind of things you're seeing in the Moore interviews, but I tend to think what you're seeing with Moore is genuine. And even though he says that he found that there are Cronkites and there are Moores and never the twain shall meet, I think there was still a disappointment in him that it didn't work out, and perhaps a feeling that it still could have, but his time had passed. Now people would not be taking him seriously for something like that. So I don't think the desire ever went away. If you look at his involvement in the late 60s, he campaigned for Bob Kennedy. He was an anti-war activist, and he would speak out against those. So he remained very outspoken on issues, and he showed a grasp of them, that he was not simply a variety or celebrity or game show host. And I think he had enough of that intelligence and passion about what was going on that he was disappointed that there was no outlet for it.
So in the early 70s, I think 71 or 72, To Tell the Truth, it was Tell the Truth gets a second wind during the daytime slot. The original host, Bud Collyer, just doesn't want to do it again.
Well, you've got it. Goodson Todman is discovering the magic of syndication, especially once the primetime access rule comes into effect, where local stations get a half an hour back from the networks. And very early on in that process, it becomes apparent that there is a demand for new syndicated programming to run as a 5-day-a-week strip. And so Goodson Todman brings back What's My Line. John Daly isn't interested in doing the revival. By that time, he's gone off to be head of the Voice of America. And Bud Collyer is dying of cancer. And so he says, when they offer him ask him if he wants to come back with To Tell the Truth, because Goodson Todman was nothing if not loyal to the people that had made them. He says, no, I can't do it. I'm not up to it. I can't do it. And so they go to Gary Moore because he's not doing anything. And Collier says, why don't you try him? And he's not doing anything. And they said, we're talking about bringing back To Tell the Truth. Bill Cullen would be one of the panelists. He was on the whole run of I've Got a Secret with You. Are you interested in doing it? Well, Moore sees this as he's come to terms, at least, even if he doesn't like it, with the idea that this is what he does very well. And he calls Collier to make sure that he's not stepping on Collier's toes. He says, if you want to do this, I'm not going to take it. They've offered it to me. It's yours if you want it. And Collier says, I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. I can't do it. Go ahead with my blessing. And so he becomes the host. And you see that everything that worked for him on I've Got a Secret goes right into To Tell the Truth. It's updated, and whereas What's My Line, I think, does not work very well in syndication because its charm came from its formality, its mock formality, dress. You didn't want to see Bennett Cerf called Bennett. You wanted to see him called Mr. Cerf. Now, that was never a problem, as I say, with either To Tell the Truth or I've Got a Secret. So actually, To Tell the Truth is a perfect show to go into syndication, and Moore is a perfect host for it. And he, again, is able to manage the panel, which he has done so well. He's able to put the guests at ease, which he has always done well. And he wanted to make it respectful of what it had originally been. He didn't want to change it. He didn't want to center it around himself again. It was a chance to have warm pacing, conversational. He had the wonderful reputation as a host. And so he goes with it, and it's a hit. It is one of the more successful syndicated shows on television. He doesn't have to worry about network politics the way he did at CBS. CBS gives its blessing that he's free to go ahead and do it. And so that starts in September of '69, and Moore stays with the show until 1976, almost the entire run of the show.
And I've often said I thought the 1970s were the golden era of television, the real golden era versus other claims of the cable era or the 1950s. And I think for me, I remember the show, especially with the ba 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 ba.
Yep.
Everything seemed, I think, better there. To me, this is the best iteration of that format kind of show. The music was good. The guests were suddenly more diverse. You'd get black faces, you'd get Chinese people, you'd get people who were authors who were writing books, but they were books that weren't just celebrity tell-alls pushing something. They were books. You'd have a panelist who may have come up with some psychological theory for such and such, or someone who had developed some cure for beriberi or something. And the panelists too. It's more laid back. It's because it's during the day and because it's syndicated. It just seemed to me that things flowed so much better. And I think Gary Moore, in that iteration, was the best host of the best version of those Goodman-Todman shows.
Yep, it worked very well. It had a colorful set, and it had a timeless sort of premise to begin with. So it wasn't going to be dated simply because of the premise.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to keep it up to date, and if you wanted to maintain its tradition but still make it relevant, Moore is the guy who can do it.
Yeah.
Moore and, I mentioned again Bill Cullen, because when you've got the two of them on the show, it's already got credibility. It's got the gravitas, which is a funny word to use when you're talking about a light game show. But gravitas in the sense that people can see that this is going to be a show that's true to its roots, but that is adapting within that. It's not going to be a wholesale change. And as you said, it turns out to be a terrific version of the show. And Gary Moore lets his hair grow a bit. He doesn't have the crew cut
Yeah.
anymore. He's probably got, a little more hair than I do, but he doesn't go, with the sideburns down to here and everything. But it's a different Gary Moore. It's the same but different. He's Gary Moore for the '70s, and so it's a great transition for him. And I don't know. I haven't read a lot because it starts to get out of the time period that I generally spend some time in. But I don't know how he felt about it. I think he enjoyed it. I think he liked doing the show. I think he was very comfortable at it, and he knew that he was very good doing it. I don't know if he thought that it was a bittersweet end to his television career, or if he was happy to go out on this kind of a successful note, that after all was said and done, and after his career had ended, and after he was off of network TV, and it appeared as if he was just going to be, in his words, sitting around collecting a paycheck for doing nothing, he gets a chance at another show that runs for 8 years. And that is not a bad way to end your career.
One last word on the '70s version of To Tell the Truth is, um, I enjoyed game shows much the way I enjoyed soap operas, or much the way that I enjoyed Saturday morning cartoons as a sort of genre. And when I look at the old black and white stuff, there is a formality to it and a stiffness to it, even in the less stiff versions of it without the tuxedos in the I've Got a Secret days.
Mm-hmm.
There still is a little bit of a stiffness when you watch it. It's almost as if you're watching Ray Harryhausen stop motion animatronics,
Yep.
where there's a creakiness to it. And if you watch modern stuff with the Steve Harveys or that kind of thing, the game show is just really almost a pretext to hear jokes. Whereas this one strikes the right balance. It's loose enough, but not so loose that it loses the formula. And this is why I think all of the '70s was really the game show hype, whether it's Bert Convey's shows, or whether it's
Mm-hmm.
Password, or whether it's... they all seem to have their best versions, in my opinion, in the 1970s. And I think it's because it wasn't too black, it wasn't right, just the right shade of gray, which is a good metaphor to talk about Gary Moore, because he's not big, he's not colorful, he is that guy in the
Mm-hmm.
background, but he's in a sense the atlas that holds everything up.
Yes, he's the anchor, the foundation, just like John Daly was on What's My Line. But getting away from that to just the casual aspect of it and how it goes versus game shows today, you're absolutely right. Gary Moore is very much old, the kind of old school, like if you're talking about sports, Keith Jackson or some of the
Yeah.
British soccer announcers, they know that people don't tune in to listen to them. It's all about the game. You never make yourself bigger than the game. And it's funny that we use game in that sense, because we're talking about a game when we mention To Tell the Truth, too. It's a game. And Gary Moore knows he's not bigger than the game. He gives the game credibility. But people tune in to see the panelists, to hear them make jokes, to get the satisfaction of these interesting contestants stumping the celebrities. You take Gary Moore out of the equation, it sinks. But Gary Moore is the glue that holds everything together. And he knows what his role is, should go without saying, but it doesn't.
Before we end this show, I just want a brief mention of a fellow we probably will end up doing a show on himself, but whose name is always sort of attached to that of Gary Moore. And I'm talking not of Durwood Kirby, but of Henry Morgan. Um,
Yes.
if you could just give a minute or
Wonderful.
two, if you could just give a minute or two, sort of as a preview for maybe a future show,
Mhm.
who Henry Morgan was and what his relationship with Moore was.
Henry Morgan was the enfant terrible of radio and then television. He was on both. He was one of the very first radio hosts to mercilessly mock his sponsors during the commercials, and he was was very successful at doing that, although he also got in trouble with it for it. But he always said what was on his mind. He was very blunt. He was very smart, very quick on the draw, and as I say, was one of the very first to incorporate his own personal commentaries into the commercials and the way he talked about his sponsors, good or bad. He would make fun of them, and sometimes that worked, and sometimes the sponsor didn't like it. But with I've Got a Secret, he was a regular on that show from the very beginning, and he was Moore's hand-picked choice to substitute for him when Moore was on vacation. He was also the one that they picked the most outrageous things to do. You don't think of I've Got a Secret as a participatory show, but they would send Morgan on these ridiculous things that he would do. And it would stump the panel. The contestant would be part of what Morgan had done. And one time, I think it was Paul Newman was on the show, and they had sent Morgan out to Dodger Stadium to watch a Dodgers game, and Paul Newman. They dressed up as a peanut vendor, and he was working Morgan's section of Dodger Stadium selling peanuts. And he comes on the show, and his secret is, I sold Henry Morgan a bag of peanuts at the Dodgers game, and he didn't recognize me. It was true. But this is a story about Newman. But that's the kind of thing they would send Morgan off on these junkets to different parts of the country or around the world, getting involved in certain things that then would play a role in I've Got a Secret. So he and Morgan were very close, and Morgan makes several appearances. He makes an annual appearance on Moore's variety show, his Christmas episode, where he will bring a bunch of Christmas cards that celebrities have sent out for Christmas, and he will hold them up to the audience, describe the colors for them because it's in black and white, and then ask people to guess what kind of person sent this card and if they can figure out who the celebrity was. So there's a strong relationship between Morgan and Moore in that sense.
And I also believe that Henry Morgan was the actor responsible for making the actor Harry Morgan go by Harry Morgan, because he went by Henry Morgan in some early roles until the union got involved. And I think Henry Morgan had sort of sicked the union on Harry Morgan.
Yeah. We're going to have a fun time talking about him. So, that's pretty much it. We come around to Moore's last hurrah in September of '77. He's been off the show for a while. He's been ill. In fact, he was seriously ill. He had esophageal cancer, but he didn't talk about it. He didn't let anybody really know how ill he had been. Most viewers didn't know he was that ill. So Bill Cullen had filled in for him, and then as the absence got longer, Joe Garagiola filled in for him. And then, of course, they had reruns that they could use to fill the time. In September of '77, it's the first show of the new season, and Moore comes out as the host. He's back, and he talks very candidly to the audience the same way he has on all of his other shows, where he makes the audience feel like they're part of the show, like he's talking to them. You develop that talent very early in radio. You've either got it or you haven't. He had it. So he talks to them and he explains he's been sick. He's got cancer. And he announces that he's retiring from the show. And he gets Garagiola up there and he is introducing him as the new permanent host of the show, giving him his blessing, and he bows out. And that's pretty much it. He makes a couple of other rare appearances in retirement. He's on a game show, bloopers show with Bill Shatner. He does a tribute to Carol Burnett on a Sally Jesse Raphael show as late as 1990. But he turned down opportunities to appear on other kinds of celebrity-driven shows like The Love Boat. He just preferred to stay in retirement. And so he moved up to Maine, spent his time fishing, doing some outdoor work because of his esophageal cancer from smoking.
And did he ever get over
He
that, or did that was that what killed him? Or
That
did
was
he,
what eventually killed him.
but so he had it
But
for a decade and a half or so.
yeah, and he obvious because of the surgeries he'd undergone in treatment of it, his voice was shot. So obviously his career was, but he died in 1993. He was only 78. He had, as I said, enjoyed living in. He lived in Hilton Head, South Carolina. He spent summers up in Northeast Harbor in Maine. He went fishing, did outdoor stuff. He became a humor columnist for an island newspaper in Hilton Head. It seems that he was at peace in his retirement, that he was comfortable with his legacy. Considering his comments that he had made, I'm not positive that he wasn't, that he still didn't have some regrets, but he seems to have, eased into that retirement and enjoyed his retirement. And when he died in 93, even though he was well on the way to being forgotten, he was still warmly remembered by a lot of people. And he was remembered as one of TV's classic hosts, not only for game shows, but for variety shows. He was remembered as, at the time, the man who'd appeared on TV more hours than anybody else. Eventually, Hugh Downs took over that role, and later it went to Regis Philbin, I think. But, he would always be remembered as a man who, for a time, was the highest paid entertainer on television, had appeared on television more than anybody else. He is considered to this day one of the greatest game show hosts of all time. Always played down his role in helping other people. But he never thought of himself as a talent scout, but he certainly helped Carol Burnett to get where she was, and she never forgot that. And I think he again has to go down as one of the great forgotten pioneers of television. Unfortunately, we don't remember him more because there isn't as much video evidence, as I said at the beginning, of what he had done as there is from some other people. But that he certainly deserves to be remembered as a great figure in television history.
Just looking, it said he also had emphysema, which was also one of the causes of his death. Television is interesting because it's a medium that, in both of our lives, had a short life before both of us entered the world. It went through some high points. It seems to me it's getting subsumed by the internet and whatever else is going to come later. But it's interesting that we have things like the Internet Archive, or for writers, Project Gutenberg, and a handful of other websites that preserve these things. The Academy of American Television does those. They've got maybe 1,500 interviews with people.
Wonderful.
Because it seems to me that these people that we're going to be talking about, like Gary Moore, who we can call forgotten stars, may only be temporarily misplaced, because forgotten. Yes, we're going through a changeover, but there's enough there that some researcher, whether human or AI, that goes looking in 78 years for certain cultural aspects of mid-20th century life. Well, game shows are about as naked a look into that as you can without actually having documentarians taking photos of people coming out of their shower.
Yeah, and as long as people like Gary Moore remain on video, accessible to people, as long as you have that, you're never going to be truly forgotten. I really like what you said there about misplaced.
Yeah.
I think that's it, because he's got a place in history you can't take away from him. And as long as you can dial him up online and see what he did, he'll never really be forgotten. He'll just I like that. He'll just be misplaced for the time.
And
That's beautiful.
And we'll be back next month with another show. So thank you for watching.
Thank you.